Great to see you, Kostis. Thanks very much for doing this. Really appreciate it. So we're going to spend about 20 minutes or so talking about your book and your ongoing research on photography in Crete. And I wanted to start by asking you to give us a sense of why you fixed on photography as the object of study rather than the many other things that seem to interest Sfakians, like guns, cars, artisan cheeses, olive oil. So why photography? What was so special about that?
Hi, Chris, and thanks very much for the invitation. To be fair, photography is something that interests people a lot. And it's not just photography as a technical medium, but it's also the visual and the question of appearance, both as a social dynamic, what does it mean to appear somewhere, but also as a physical, as an aesthetic notion. So photography became a way to conceptualize and understand this local attention to appearance. Also, the way in which the region has been historically constructed and understood is heavily mediated by photography, and it's heavily visual. And it was a very clear absence in the way I was conceptualizing originally the research. There was a very clear absence of an attention to what visual culture and what the visual can offer us. So there was a lot of theorization when it comes to center, periphery, power, questions in the bibliography, generally speaking, not just the Mediterranean and European one. There was a very clear emphasis on the question of victimizing oneself because you conform to expectations, tourism, and so on. But there was very little, there was nothing essentially about what photography can do, what photography does in this constellation. So I tried to keep an ethnographic open mind, and once I arrived at the field site, I realized that the visual was much more important than I had understood before. I realized that there was even tangible images of people from the area who had been turned into sort of symbols in food products in a lot of different places. And I realized that appearance and photographs was something that people discussed all the time. They would evaluate co-villagers based on visuality and appearance and aesthetics. They would discuss known photographs of people from somewhere. They were in a sort of constant lookout for images of people in archives. So it was something actually that cut to the core of everything else they did. So it's not photography as a specialized sort of independent field of research. It's photography informing every other thing that goes on there socially and culturally.
So they immediately got the project. They understood why you were studying photography, presumably. They
understood immediately, and also the whole research was mediated ethnographically through my own photographs. So I immediately entered into that sort of cultural field. Before me were all these other outsiders with cameras, and that's the thing that we're going to discuss, I imagine, at the end, which is how this whole lineage of outsiders with cameras breaks recently with the digital and how that is disrupted. But I was immediately sort of drawn into an entire old tradition of people with cameras and conversation between outsiders with cameras and residents. And my own archival work, I started disseminating and passing it around, gifting it to people, and also my own images became part of, which is why I have this slide here. I don't think I discussed it in the original, but this is the book on the left, the cover, and then on the right, a friend, a German sort of interlocutor from later research, she goes into one of the coffee houses and finds the flyer of the book along with a portrait of a man that I had taken back in my original work in the 2006, 2007. And the man had the coffee house proprietor had placed them up on the coffee house wall. And that's an indication.
Must be very gratifying to see your work being recycled in that way, or embraced rather than.
Yes, it is very gratifying, and that's something also you note. I remember in Camera Indica, taking pictures of people becomes a way of trying to say thanks in many ways, reciprocating. And once this is given another sort of field of exhibition, yes, it's definitely very gratifying to feel that you're doing something that matters to someone. And taking pictures is a...
Yeah, so why, I mean, it's a bit of a puzzle then, isn't it, as to why prior to the mobile phone there was so little self-photography, so few, you know, cheap cameras in circulation. Well, so it's almost as though Sfakians, you know, submitted themselves through that refusal to being represented by outsiders, by others.
No, that's a very important question. I think one easy way to sort of describe what's happening is that they didn't necessarily feel they were submitting themselves. I think there's an understanding of agency partly there, whereby the photographed subject has all the agency. And I saw this when people discussed postcards, for instance. Of course, they are very torn and ambivalent about this, because part of what they describe and part of what they say is that these people were exploited and they became the objects of photographers. But another part of what they say is that like a beautiful image is merely something that stems from the photographed subject's properties. But it's a deeply also technomaterial historical question, what you're asking. And I think it sort of concerns broadly other areas of the world, not just Sfakia. In many ways, people had much less access to the technical means of producing representations of oneself. And they also had much less access to the domains that mattered. So even if you took pictures with a small Kodak, I mean, John Tagg describes this very bitterly, as you would imagine, but he says that these sort of amateur photographs were very limited in terms of where they could be accessed, what they could do. They were in the family, they were in the family album. In many ways, the digital hasn't disrupted that entirely, but there is still a much greater audience, and the quality and the technical, it's much more satisfying to the people. I mean, we'll discuss this later on.
So one of the things I find particularly compelling about your work, Kostis, is it's going beyond what one might think of as the Saidian binary of, you know, the outside or the inside, the Occident, the Orient, you know, however one wants to separate it out. And so your work and thinking, I think, transcends the binary to show how, well, to explore that ambivalent space in between where images get retranslated, relocated. There's this sort of space of spillage, of iteration, so one gets a real sense of a material process of reception, of viewing, of embracing the image, of relocating the image, you know, from, say, an early German traveler, you know, who in Saidian terms might be simply an external misrepresenter or fantasist. But what you show is how those fantasies, in a sense, are partly internalized by Sfakians. So how this concern with appearance and self-image is not something that is self-present and produced simply from an internal source, but it is the product of this incredibly complicated translation and negotiation.
Yes, thanks very much for describing it so well. Again, I try to retain an ethnographic approach to this. So I try to heed very carefully at what was happening and what people sensed. And photography and appearance became a very suitable place to actually look at the complexity of the transaction. And as you described, it would be very easy for an ethnographer to just say, okay, we have the fantasists, we have those who construct the stereotype, who have the bourgeois demand, the urbanites fantasy, and then you have the locals who totally reject this, they resist, and they are the antithesis, they are the resisting force, and they want something else. But the complexity in Sfakia was that the same kinds of fantasies that the urbanite visitors wanted, the fantasists wanted, were partly what the locals wanted. But this partiality was the key. And that's where the ethnography steps in. The partiality means that the locals had their own criteria, that these things were endlessly recoded, and there was discussions around them, and some people didn't like them, others wanted them. And also the visual and photography was a very good place to actually theorize the historic of this into in a historical perspective. And that's where I had this image here, where you have the fantasist on the left, the urban photographer who's employed by the government in the 30s, and she's documenting tradition as the regime wants it to be seen. So on the one hand, this image is an image of the external fantasist. But then I start by looking into locals' archives and local poses in everyday life. I start finding the same motif in other places. And I find this, and I then look at other things and ethnographic information and data and so on. And I kind of theorize this in the end as this is not merely the fantasist product, nor just the pure local aesthetic. It's where the local aesthetic and the external demands sort of merge, and they become really complexly intertwined. And this informs a lot of other fields. To go back to another comment you made about how the material is transfigured and how it becomes, this is a more sort of ethnographic social life of image.
This is one of the many old guys who's been in that wonderful phrase, postcarded.
Yes, he's one of the people who've been postcarded, and his image is found in a lot of places. From a Saidian perspective, this postcardization obviously is very hegemony laden. He's turned into a product, into an object, and you can find the Saidian critique in locals' own expressions and utterances. So a lot of people would critique the photographers for doing a hit and run and exploiting local. So the Saidian is not just a Saidian, there's definitely a local sensibility as well in some ways. But at the same time, there's lots of strange reuses that partly undermine the original coding of the image. So here on the right,
so not one or other, but both. I mean, I think that's an important part of your thinking and the complexity of it, that it's an entanglement of two things at the same time.
And resistance is never really unitary and complete. It's always partial and incomplete. And that's something that comes out of the book as well. There's different contexts, social contexts, where things play out differently, and there's also different and very ambivalent dynamics as to how people describe these things. But in this juxtaposition here, what's happening is a kind of one of the clear moments where something that is external, hegemonic, comes from the outside, becomes internal and becomes different. So the postcard image, which is all of those things we described, and Said would call them exoticizing. On the right, it's been turned into a familial image. Now, obviously, the parameter of power that is very stark here is that the locals had to go to the market and actually buy an image of their uncle and grandfather in order to use it as a familial image. So that's a very stark reminder of asymmetry. A local society has to go and find its image on the market, made by an Athenian, Athens-based or whatever commercial photographer. But in the process of using it, they turn it into something else. And this emphasis on the familial and the affective and the personal, in some ways, eludes and sort of counters the commercial.
So this would be a beautiful example of the old man in the mountain trope. And one of the striking things with mobile phone camera photography is that the gender dynamics seem to be transformed. I mean, maybe that's a rather simplistic way of reading it, but I'd be very fascinated to hear more about what you think mobile phone photography is then doing to that archetype of the man on top of the mountain.
The very important question, which the way you phrased it sort of touches this, is what mobile photography does. In some ways, this is enabled by the technical means, which is something that we don't really think about as often. We think of the mobile phone as something that is just appropriated culturally, but in some ways, what's happened with so this is part of the later research I've done, part of the photo demos research that I started with our project at UCL in 2016, is I started seeing public exhibitions of types of images that were entirely absent. And one type of image that was entirely absent was one in which women, young women, sort of took the stage and they did things with photography. And that's something that was just not there. So we're talking about a technical transformation where we have a new stage and a new place of where things are commented, and new topics as well. So if this is the sort of dominant iconography, male and also national, we have in the Sfakian social media these new kinds of images where women actively step in and they comment on the male iconography. Now, again, this is partial resistance and partial critique because they don't really disavow this entirely. So some of these women would, like the woman on the left, whose image actually appeared in the photo exhibition I organized in 2018. She's humorously saying, my father doesn't have sons, so I have to step in and I become the shepherd. But the way in which she poses is also a reminder of the fact that she's not a shepherd. And on the right, we have women posing on the mountain with a caption, a humorous caption, men, capital letters. And then we have another woman who's sort of using the beach as an object of interest. And that's the juxtaposition on the right, is that this is very much more kindred to Instagram photography of Sfakia by tourists. And the juxtaposition here speaks to the fact that these new kinds of iconographies, women on the mountain, the beach, they may be disrupting the Sfakian normative, but they are normative at another level. So in terms of global iconography of the landscape as a place of leisure and fun, this is much more compliant with that. But in terms of Sfakian male demands, this is much less compliant. And have these kinds of reactions where things are recorded with the exhibition.
Mm. And I think you had an image of which seemed to be expressive of female possession of space. Or,
yes, this one
was very striking.
I think this is about possession, as you rightly point out, and it's also about a less formalist, solemn iconography. It's about a playful body that bends and is much more sort of malleable than the body of the male who poses on the peak, which can be found in this kind of iconography, which of course contains a lot of the romantic, key romantic, even German romanticism sort of iconographic elements.
So are males using their mobile phones to still reproduce that archaic iconography?
Yes, absolutely. Again, thinking with the book's original, of course, argument, they are partly appropriating the national formula for something that is very localist at the same time.
Right. Well, it was fantastic, Kostis. We could talk for hours, and I hope we get the opportunity to do so soon, but we should probably conclude at this point. So thanks once again.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks very much.